Hello, how are you again? Hoping everybody is enjoying peace at home with everything that we're doing at home. I'm going to tell you today, we're going to start in with tailoring hems. And it's on page 100 of our textbook. The hem will need a little bit of interfacing, and it will need, what works best is a bias edge of your hair canvas. So notice that as I'm cutting here, my grain line is on the bias so that it has stretch to it. And let me just read here what it tells us, and you will read this also, but it says hems in the sleeves and lower edges of tailored garments are interfaced with strips of interfacing to add body and to support the weight of the hem so that your hem doesn't sag. The fabric generally is a little heavier. Interfacing also adds strength and prevents stretching in hems, which are subject to wear. When hems are interfaced, hemming stitches in the edge of the hem do not show through to the right side or the public side. If using woven or weft insertion, fusible interfacing, or hair canvas interfacing, cut strips on the true bias, which I was just showing you, okay, on the true bias. And if using fusible knit or non-woven fusible interfacing, cut strips so the crosswise stretch goes around the body so that we know that lengthwise stretch isn't going to happen as much as crosswise because the body stretches side to side as we move. So we're going to be using, for the most part, this hair canvas, and I'm cutting it so that it has the true bias. So that is a strip there. And any of our other pieces, and in my jacket I have, in my hem, I think I have a combination. In the sleeve I have some hair canvas stitched on like we're describing. And in the hem of my jacket, I have a lightweight fusible because I felt like hair canvas would probably be a little more strength than I needed. But it's a combination of things. The blue jacket out of this fabric is, that I show so often, has the hair canvas like is shown here. It has it in the hem of the jacket, and it has it also in the hem of the sleeves, both. So it just depends on the weight of your fabric, and sometimes in the weight of your hair canvas. This is a very lightweight hair canvas here, and this is, I think, a little slightly bit heavier. I think it's this one is what I have in here. So let's go in and talk about the corners. You see how I did a mitered corner here, and this happens, I'm going to clip it loose here. I went ahead and stitched it down, but the mitered corner is an angled, you can see here it's angled upward, and that's often how a corner will be done on a sleeve. At the corner of a sleeve, let me clip it out a little bit more here so that you can see it a little better. Just went in and really sewed it in there, so it's having to undo it. When you cut it to begin with, you will cut on the bias up the angle, the 45-degree angle, and then stitch those two together. So this seam allowance and this seam allowance are both on the bias, and you know, I could make it stretch too there because of that, but then stitch that together down to make the point, and then when you turn it back to the other side so that the hem is on the underside, it has a nice flat corner. You're not having to fold pieces over and trim them. It's just a really nice corner edge there. So you see that my bias interfacing extends from the fold up edge of the hem right here, right where it's folded up, and extends up a little bit above. And you can see in the book on page 101, it'll show a lot of these concepts here. So check through those steps to see what is being talked about. And this talks about the fusible method down below, and it's talking about mitering, which I just talked about. Here is all of your interfacing that is talked about in our tailoring book on the pages that I talked to you about in the email. Here is our bias strips of that hair canvas spliced together here, one layer just over the top of the other, because you get to a point you're running out of enough bias strips, so you have to stitch some together. But you see how it extends up higher and wider here than our hem. And so this is how we're going to just do the catch stitch around the corner here. And remember how the catch stitch is, the catch stitch basically comes towards you. You entered the fabric and attach the hem portion to the interfacing portion. And so here we are with doing our catch stitch onto, we're hemming our hem piece onto just the hair canvas. So enter, boy, you're going to get this catch stitch figured out real quick. So into the hem and then into the hair canvas, and just a little stitch away from yourself to attach this, and we'll progress around the corner. As we come around this corner, I remember saying to you earlier when we were working on this that Claire Schaefer always encourages a corner like this. Let's say this would be the under portion of the sleeve vent, and you can do this with a hem skirt vent, any kind of a vent, and the vent at the back of the jacket it also can be done this way. But she suggests that when, and I really like this about it because it has the layers not all just stacked up on top of one another, to push a little bit further this little folded up piece so that it attaches right in here. And then over the top we will put the lining. So right in here, we're just going to stitch this into place this way, just slip stitch it into place. And it's, you know, it's good to have double thread if you can have that. Single thread will hold it too, because we're going to put a lining over the top. So just slip stitch that into place, and then when you're done, just come one direction, stitch down, go back in and stitch another direction, and a third time should do the trick to have it nicely tacked into place. And then to go ahead and stitch up this direction and have that whole side stitched into place. Okay, here is our exterior pocket that has its lining. It's a patch pocket. Remember, it has a little strip of interfacing right underneath the lining on this side, and we stitched it all together and then basted this part at the bottom. We sewed that closed and ironed it nicely, and now we have it placed right where we want it. It's a good thing to have some tailor tacks up in the corners. If you have one tailor tack here and a tailor tack on the other side, and you match those corners of the pocket, generally it'll stay and be nice and correct all the way around if you've got those tacks in the right spot. So let's go in and start here and just stitch it into place this way. All right, we're gonna make sure to anchor it real nicely here at the top, but this will make our pocket look like it just is kind of laid upon the outer side of the garment. And this is also the way Chanel jacket pockets are done, with a lining this way, and after they are applied and stitched on by hand like this, then a trim can be placed across the top with a nice button. And you can do a Chanel type pocket, any kind of patch pocket like this can be decorated on your jacket. You can have your trim resemble a Chanel type garment. Here is the interior of the jacket with the lining pinned into place, and all the way around I checked to make sure that I had my ease in the proper positioning here along this chest area. That's where oftentimes you need ease, and all the way up, pinned into place, and then pinned in these areas and around the neck, and then down the other side. So let me pull it back up this way. This is how it looks when it's pinned into place. Okay, this is preparing it to be stitched into place by putting our pins in. And I noticed sometimes it's good for me to see these things so that I can help you correct yours. I noticed on mine at the back of the neck, this kind of will show you what the jacket is like and where all the pins are everywhere around the whole facing a neck edge. It should be pinned into place, but I see on mine that where I thought I needed my center back, I have it's tighter on this side of my center back and not quite as tight on this side, which tells me that I haven't aligned my center back quite correctly. And honestly, it would be the center back neck most of the time where you are going to start pinning. So this is where I started pinning, and I think that I didn't have it quite centered. So I want to move some of the ease in my lining over to this section. So that's what I'm doing right here. I want you to know, and just remember this, I don't know if you've learned this before. I try to teach this to anybody who is making a garment with a lining involved. You always want your lining to be more billowy and full. It's not, you don't want your lining to ever be super tight on the inside of the garment. You want your lining to be slightly larger than the outside of the garment. And if you think about that, why that is so that the lining doesn't function to pull the outer shape of the garment in towards it. The outer side of the garment, the public side, is to have its own shape, and the lining is quiet and just supportive on the inside, and it doesn't, you should not even know it's there if it's in the right spot. So make sure that it doesn't pull the outer portion of the garment out of shape. So here I'm going to start here on this is the neck seam right here. It's not neck seam, shoulder seam. Strike that, it's not the neck seam, it's the shoulder seam. So we're going to stitch through the seam allowance that already exists on my garment, on my jacket, and through the pinned edge, and stitch this into place around the neck edge, and then we'll go into other portions of it. So just stitch right on the line that's already sewn in there, okay? Just follow the previous stitching. That's the best way to do it, right along the edge of your interfacing. All right, so once we have that all stitched into place, then we're ready to remove our pins from that section. And we're not needing really to go in and see if it looks okay on the other side, because it, you know, just check it, make sure that you've got everything stitched in the right place, no tucks and gathers, and it should all be in the right place. And usually you don't have to trim a lining because it's not bulky, it's not going to cause any kind of bulk to take place. So I'm going to make sure I have this pinned nicely, and then I'm going to start down the side of our lapel, or it's not lapel, down the side of the facing. All right, and since I want to sew with my needle on the edge here, I want the raw edge to be to my right, I'm going to feed it in this direction. And so make sure that you can get down as far as it'll open up where you can start. I'm having a little struggle doing that, but we'll get down here. All right, and this is probably, don't make your seam allowance too large here. You want your seam allowance to be no bigger than the 5/8 and maybe just slightly smaller than the 5/8. But this is all pinned into place, so we're going to stitch this all in, and where I am right now, I'm going right beside my bound buttonholes. Hi there! You guys were a lot of work. So stitch that straight in all the way up. We're going to go clear up to the top. Okay, so here we are right at the very tippy top, so just sew off the edge and clip your thread, and then you can go on the other side and remove your pins, and just make sure that the stitching is all straight and that you like it, and then remove your pins, and we're ready to move to the other side. So here we have, this is basically how we went in to pin everything into place. I'm doing this on the other side so that we can stitch the other side. So just make sure that you have pins, that if you're going to use pins, you can hand baste before you stitch in your lining, but you have to make sure your pins are set up so you can sew over the top of them, and then leave a little extra down here of length, because that's what we're going to stitch into place down here onto the hem area. This little extra length will get stitched in right down in here. So now that we have this all stitched in, let's go in and turn it to cover all of our interior that we worked on so hard, and for the shaping, and see how it hangs into place very nicely. Very nicely. I'm going to still go back in and stitch these little sections down. but I'm going to do that off camera. All right, the next thing that I want all of you to do after you get your lining into place like this, go in and tack your arm side sleeve lining into place and match up your seams, match everything up here, and we're going to be stitching this in by hand. I remember Claire Schaefer teaching, what did she call that stitch? It's kind of a backward hitch or something of that sort, she called it. But we're going to be about 3/8 inch away from the seam edge. We're going to be stitching this way. Stitch this all into place by hand. And you see how you enter the fabric through all layers. You go through everything, and then you come back up, and then when you enter again, you go back into the fabric right at that spot that you came out the last time. And this anchors it very nicely by hand. Okay, and just do, the stitch lengths are probably 1/2 inch long. But measure and pin into place, and then when you come up over the top of the shoulder pad, make sure there's plenty of space up in here and just sew into the shoulder pad that stitch. I wanted to address a question that I had about the tailored collar. I had one question about when it is the under collar gets applied to the jacket, and this is the jacket that this pattern attaches to, or that it's part of. And if you can see here, this is the same collar as this one, and it attaches right here. This part attaches right there, and these two side pieces attach over in this area right here. And so it attaches before you would stitch it on to the back body and shoulder area before you apply the upper collar. And that was one point that I didn't make super clear because I was just working on the collar and not attaching it to an actual jacket. But if you see here, you can tell where it fits in here. Here's this part right here. So that's how that works. Would just be right in here. To answer that question, the under collar attaches to the back and just extends that whole back, and then you apply the upper collar. Here is a Claire Schaefer book that shows the cardigan jacket, which is basically the Chanel jacket. And she does collect Chanel clothing. And I wanted to show you here on page 88 where she talks about how to set the sleeve. This is not exactly how we're going to do it because Chanel cardigan jackets are very soft and they don't have the shoulder pads and all the structure that we're putting in with interfacing. But she does show what I'm going to talk about today is how to attach the lining at the sleeve seam, the arm side sleeve seam. So here Claire Schaefer is showing how she has stitched the lining in by hand, and I'm going to show that, how she taught us to do kind of a back stitch hitch sort of stitch. And you see how she here has the lining stitched in, and then she shows how she pulls the sleeve lining up out of the sleeve where ours should be already. It's already attached at the wrist hem, and pull it up out of the sleeve. The very top seam allowance portion gets folded over and then pinned into place. And notice how she pins diagonally. I learned diagonal pinning from her and from Susan Kalji. They do diagonal seam clipping when they're doing curve clipping, and they also do slant pinning. So I think that's probably a good thing to do. You see here where she has it nicely pinned in here, and then she's going to stitch it into place. And that's what I'm going to show you. Today we're going to work on showing how to do that back stitch hitch. Here we have our sleeve lining. Well, it's not the sleeve lining, the body lining at the sleeve is pinned into place. It's pinned all around where the sleeve was sewn in. It's pinned into that seam allowance there all the way around. And when you come up to the top portion up here over the shoulder pad that sticks out a little bit, just pin into the shoulder pad. That's the part that you're going to be stitching to. Remember, we already have our shoulder pad stitched down to this shoulder seam allowance lightly, and all of this will work to do it this way. So we pin and match your notches, match your seam allowances so that you know you have your lining in the same way that it's lying flat against the body of the jacket, in the same manner that the jacket is cut. Let me show you while we're at it how this actually looks. The lining of my jacket is now all sewn in, all up the side here onto the facing. It's sewn in up here around the neck, and then begins back onto the facing and down to the other side. This is what it's covering. It's covering all of what we have done inside, all of our weeks and weeks of hard work in there. And remember, the lining attaches at the facing. And that's what the facings are for. They're built in all around the edges of the jacket, these facings. Let me show you up in this area, right up here. On this side, I couldn't get in by machine, where I stitched by machine up to here and stitched by machine to here. But this part I folded over and tucked underneath and stitched it in by slip stitch. And that's the same thing I have prepared over here to do by slip stitch, to enter in at one end. I could start here or I could start here, but I'm going to start up here and just enter in to the fabric, pull your thread up and make sure all the knot and everything is underneath, and then go ahead and attach it and make your stitching invisible. That's one of the things I really like about Claire Schaefer's close-up drawings of her stitches. She shows how to make them invisible. And you stitch into the fabric and then into the little roll of your lining and attach it in place. Now, when I did this on the opposite side of my jacket, I stitched this way, and then I came back in and stitched in between the stitches that I had made so that it was really nicely tucked down, because I really wanted it to stay nicely in place. There are just times and places where you can't get into some of these little spots with a sewing machine very well, and so you do it by hand. So let me go back here to this back stitch that we're doing here to stitch into place our sleeve, the lining at the sleeve. This is the sleeve lining. This is the body lining stitched in at the sleeve. So what I'm doing is a back stitch, and I'm going through all layers that I have, all the seam allowance layers there, and pulling it up, removing the pins as I go. So when I come up, I then go back to where I ended that stitch before, all right, and come back, and just don't make it any wider than about a 4/8. You don't want to stitch deeply into the arm side, but probably about a 1/2 inch long back stitch. This is just hand stitching our lining in at the sleeve. So when we do get up here to the top of our sleeve, and you notice how I'm holding only the shoulder pad and the seam allowance, and that's all that I want this stitching to go through, and I generally go just through the shoulder pad itself. That, in all my jackets that I've made through all the years, that has always seemed to be enough. If you want to go clear through and stitch down into the seam allowance, you can do that if you want. That would be okay. But this is just mostly to hold the body lining in at the sleeve, and we're doing those same back stitch movements that are about a 1/2 inch long, and just getting it nicely sewn into place so that we're ready to put the sleeve lining into its spot. So where I have the sleeve already stitched into place, let me show you. This is kind of rushing it a little bit. I'm not completely done, but I have this pinned with one pin right here on the top of the sleeve. Right in here. I've been keeping it there, pinned right in the top of the sleeve. So I'm going to remove that right now and show you how I'm going to pull that sleeve lining up. It's a good idea to have your sleeve out straight so your arm can go in there, and make sure that your lining is coming up out of that. Just pull it up out of that the way it functions in there, because sometimes I've ended up with it twisted. That's not good. You don't want it twisted. So make sure that it's coming up in a straight manner. Find the top little notch that goes at the shoulder seam. Okay, and this is how it's going to be tucked under and pinned right there into place. So start there, and don't pin it too much past where you just did your stitching in. Pin it pretty close to right on that line that you stitched in, and you may have to pull up a little bit of your ease stitching. You should have some stay stitching in there so that you could pull that up and shrink down the size of the head of the lining at the sleeve if you need that. But go ahead and pin, tuck under the seam allowance and pin into place all the way around, all the way around. And make sure, if you have to make adjustments, go ahead and do that. I usually try to pin down from one side of the head of the sleeve at the shoulder seam, and then I'll try to pin a little bit the other direction so that I can kind of tell if I'm spreading the fullness properly. If there is a big bunch of extra fullness when you get to the underarm seam, then just go readjust things, okay? So can you see that? You just pin that into place, and then I'll show later how to slip stitch that into place. Now we're gonna go, the next thing we're gonna do is at the bottom. We've got, you know, a decent amount of ease in our lining here at our facing edge, and here are my buttonholes, the underside of the buttonholes. So we've got to fold up, and notice this corner right here. Make sure you'll have a little bit of extra right here generally, to make sure that you fold that piece under and tuck it back a little bit, like I showed you Claire Schaefer likes you to do, so that nothing peeks out from the underside over here. And then just pin into place. And one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to push it up just a little bit so that there's some ease right in here. And you're going to want to do that all the way around. Push it up just a little bit so that there's just kind of some roundness right in here. This will help with the lining not pulling the outside of the jacket into a bubble. It will make the outside of the jacket be able to hang in a real relaxed, comfortable way all the way along, because it will not be too tight. You want your lining to be a little bit billowy inside, okay? So we're just gonna pin, and you see here, I have a seam here, I have a seam there, so I know that I'm matching in the correct place, and try to get those as exactly lined up as you can. And you might have to adjust things a little bit in the space before that, and just make sure that everything's tucked under and just ready for you to go in and slip stitch it into place. You're going to do this all the way around, and remember, this is over this hem that we did our catch stitching into place. So we're just stitching this to the top of that, down about maybe an inch or so, ½ inch from the hem that we catch stitched into place. So just keep going in that manner all the way around. So I just entered in this little corner down here with my thread, and I think it's good to do a double thread on this for strength. You want this lining stitched in nice and sturdily. So I entered right here at the corner, and then a little bit later I'm going to go ahead and slip stitch that down. But let me just show you. Hold it the way I'm holding it. Stitch into only the turned up hem fabric. Make sure to hold your thread so it doesn't knot up on you. And we're just going to stitch this into place. So you enter into the garment fabric, and then just very quickly go up into the lining fabric. And slip stitching means that as soon as you find a place where you come back out of the lining, you immediately go into the garment fabric again. So your stitching looks almost invisible. If somebody looked for where the thread is, they wouldn't be able to find it. It would be hidden inside, and inside this little fold right here. All right, so that gets to be done all the way along. Sometimes I will speed it up a little bit by doing a couple of I won't pull the thread all the way through. I'll do a couple close together, and then I'll go, and that's when you really don't want it to knot. So hold your thread as it comes through. And it's going to attach like that all the way down. All right, so we have our lining stitched in. Notice how it just is looking so much more finished. It covers all the stuff inside, all of our hard work, all of our structuring hard work. So you see how there is a little bit of billowy ease in our lining all the way up, and it's stitched by machine from here. We stitched in the lining all around this way, and remember, right up in here I couldn't get it under the machine needle well enough, so this just got tucked under and slip stitched into place, and then all of this area got sewn by machine. Really had to make sure on this one, I had to go in even after I stitched it the first time and redistribute the fullness here so that there's plenty of ease. Oftentimes there's a little pleat in here so that the lining can stretch side to side from up there, because the lining has ease in it. And so we got that in, and then this little portion stitched by hand because it's like the matching one over here, and then all of this side went in by machine. Down to about here I stopped, and I did this portion by hand because it's really important to get these little corners squared off, and sometimes it's a lot easier to just tuck that under and slip stitch it into place, and then tuck under this bottom hem and slip stitch it into place, and it's slip stitched all the way along the hem. And notice how there's a little bit of a billowy portion. It's a little bit looser all the way along, looser than the outside garment, but it's all stitched in by hand, by slip stitch there. After getting this bottom hem in and making sure that we have enough space in our lining so that if we pulled on it, it could actually pull down and billow over our bottom hem a little bit. You don't want your lining to ever hang underneath the jacket, and I have had that happen to me. So when that happens, you pull loose your stitching and tuck up a little bit more to shorten it. But you want to have a nice fullness in your lining, so that so the outside of the garment can lie smooth and not be pulled by the lining. So here, next thing, got the sleeve all sewn into place here, all of it, and you have to make sure that you get your ease all stitched in where it needs to go, and then you can pull and remove your basting stitch that allows you to put the ease in, that you pull and create the ease. And now I'm pulling the sleeve out, so you see the lining of the sleeve, and you see there's a little bit of extra fullness right in here too, so that the sleeve lining doesn't cause the sleeve to pull up. If just for instance, if I shortened it, it would cause my sleeve to pucker on the public side. So that's why we have a nice full amount of ease on that, and just all the way around. So we stitched it in over the top of that back stitch that secured the body lining right at the arm side. And over here I have it under construction still, I wanted to make sure you could see how this is pinned into place. And remember, I told you how the slant pins do make a difference. What they will help with is keeping that rolled, curved edge. They will keep it in a smoother manner. If you put the pins in straight, it causes a less curved edge to happen in this sleeve installation, and it just makes it harder to make it a curved edge as you're stitching around. And that's how I got this in with its curved edge as it progressed around. So the slant of the pins, you can really kind of see it over here. It just keeps the edge that you're trying to work on a lot more tucked under properly. And while you're going, you're trying to distribute all of the ease all the way around. All right, let me show you. Sometimes tucking it in around in this curved edge gets a little tricky, but you want to not make your seam allowance that you tuck under any larger than about a 1/2 inch, because that's what helps create the ease that is built into your lining. You make your seam allowances a tiny bit smaller, and that will make your lining a little bit larger. So as I prepared all of this, I would just fold it under. You just basically tuck it up under, and use the head of the point of the pin, insert it, and then just pin it into place, so that when you sew up to it, you have it already tucked into place there. Okay, and let's take a look right in here. Let's remove some of these pins to see how my back stitching, how I back stitched. I showed you how I did that, and you enter most all of the layers of the seam allowance. You don't necessarily have to go through into this sleeve head portion, but I can see that I did. Just enter through enough of the seam allowance to anchor your lining into place. So you're just going to stitch down into that, and then come back up, and then stitch backward into all the layers again, and go forward in front of the stitch that you just made, and then come backward and enter again through all layers, and then just keep repeating that so that it ends up looking, let me make sure you can see that pretty well. It's dark against dark, but it just anchors this all into place, so that this is hand stitched, and you see how it's nicely in. Now, you can, and some would want to, stitch this in by machine. You can do that, but this is what you're going to run into. You're going to run into not as much control over what and how it's stitched. You could do it with and if you are going to stitch it in by machine, I would say go with a longer stitch that you could adjust or maybe pull out. But the reason this is a good way to do it by hand is because you have so much more control over how your lining adjusts, and you can see if you have it kind of in the wrong place, because you have to pin all of this in to stitch this in back stitch. And also, this is a more couture way of doing a tailored jacket, but you still could use a machine to stitch your sleeve lining in if you need to. All right, but you see here, this is my basting stitch. This was the stitch that I used to create the ease in my sleeve. And so I have mine showing a little bit I'm going to remove it after I'm all done, but sometimes it is in a place where it can really help you fold and lay flat your sleeve lining. This is the actual sleeve lining. And then you see how pull it with your little pinpoint so that you can pin it right into place, right where you want it to be when you come through to slip stitch it into place. And that's basically how I created, and make sure to pull everything out of the way that you don't want in there, and pin it into place this way. And then I've got my needle and thread here, and this is basically the way you will go in to stitch it into place. Just have your thread installed with a knot, go down into a couple of layers. You don't have to go deep into this. You don't have to go clear through to the shoulder pad and all the different parts, but you have to go deep enough that you can actually sew it into place. And then just stitch this way. Make sure that having a little practice will help you, but you probably want to make your stitches about 1/4 inch long, not really any longer than that, and just stitch all the way around. Make sure that the needle pokes back out of your little turned under edge right where you want it. And I see right here this little piece is poking out in kind of a point, so I'm taking my pin point and I'm going to poke it. I'm going to find a way to poke it back under there a little bit better until it smooths out. See how that ended up smoothed out? And now I can stitch on past it, and just remove your pins as you go. Okay, these pins ended up a little bit straighter as I pulled the jacket sleeve out. So go ahead and finish all the way around to the bottom and anchor your thread, and then you'll have your sleeve lining in like this one at the shoulder. Getting close to the end. We've got our buttons to sew into place, and I made sure that I kept my buttons in my pocket and pinned the pocket flap closed so that I didn't lose them, and even so lost track of them one day. So make sure you know where your buttons are. And the way we're going to figure out where we want our button to be, you can try on your jacket, and one other way, try it on and then pin into place if you don't already have it decided. And make sure, one of the things that I found is I have mine marked, but I went in and pinned the sides together the way I like them to look, and then found this little point right here. Sometimes it's good to lay it out on a surface, or let me do it this way, sometimes just on a hanger, so you can find where the button is going to rest. You know that the button's going to rest on this end of your buttonhole we've talked about in class before. So we've got that one marked, and I marked this one the same way and this one the same way. So I went ahead and installed one of the buttons and put it into place here, and then have this one ready to go. And I know that you have sewn buttons on before, but I want to make sure that we all do it kind of the same way, because this is a really kind of high-end garment we're making, and after all the work we've done, we want our buttons to look wonderful. So we're going to pretty much measure how far over, if we know this button is in the right place, then give a straight line up here so that we enter from the surface, from the public side of the garment, go through all layers to the back side, and then come back up just beside it, just right beside, because I have a 2-hole button. If you have a 4-hole button, you're going to have to adjust for that. All right. So now that we have our knot, and you see my knot is a little bit furry, and you can try to clip that away a little bit. Sometimes it just doesn't want to cooperate. Boy, we'll have to do a good vacuum cleaning job when this is all done. But stick your button on through the hole, onto the thread, and make sure that you're going to align your the hole stitching. The direction that you stitch your holes should go the same direction as your buttonhole. So we're going to do horizontal here, and so enter back in the other side and make sure that you get it pulled in there. And you want to make sure too that you leave a little bit of wiggle space, all right, with your button. You don't want to just slam it against the garment. And these first few stitches I watch pretty carefully where from the back side I re-enter, because it's not secure and well enough obvious. All right, so I've still got a little bit of wiggle room, and go back in and out a few times, and then we pretty well have established where the stitching is going to go. And now you can take out your pin and just go in and stitch. I've got my thumb up against where the stitching is so that I know I'm entering this hole and going back down the other hole, and just fill it up with about 6 to 8 to 10 stitches, however many you think you need. And when you get to the end, we're going to wrap it and make a shank. So when we get enough stitches in the holes to really hold the button in place, don't go all the way through, just go this direction into the top layer, into just under the button. And then we're going to wrap our thread several times and pull it to make a shank, and this will really hold your button nicely into place. And then stitch back through, under, stitch through one side. I usually stitch through one side, I stitch through the other side, same way, and this is into the fabric. And then I anchor with one more little stitch, and then at the bottom or the top, and then clip the thread. And that should hold your button in pretty good, make sure it has a little wiggle room, that it still has that. Part of the reason for the wiggle room is so that once it is buttoned into the buttonhole, it still has a little give to it so that it doesn't just smash the buttonhole open, and it sits nicely on top of your fabric and looks really nice where you placed it. Hello there. This is a happy day for me. You see what I'm holding? My jacket is done. I'm so glad. I wanted to rejoice by going out to dinner or going somewhere fun, but I can't go anywhere. So I dressed up anyway in the dress that I made to go with my jacket. I made this dress a few weeks ago. I didn't just make it yesterday. It took me a little bit of time. But I made it so that it would go with the jacket. So let me show you what the inside looks like. All of it finished, all the pins out, and everything finished up. So let me try it on for you over my dress. So now I have a whole outfit, and this is what I was going to go ahead and wear for the fashion show. But guess I can't do that either. So I'll just wear it and show it to you. And one day I'll be able to wear it out somewhere. But here's my jacket. And I love it. When I first got up out of bed this morning, I put it on. I tried it on first thing this morning. It felt so comfortable and good and nice to have it finished. But let me go ahead and show you all the way. And hopefully what I can get from you is, when you're completed and done with your item, to photograph it and send it to me.